Thanks very much. And thank you for this opportunity. It's a special opportunity for me to talk about Patrick Lucey. As many of you may know, Patrick Lucey was born right here in La Crosse at St. Francis Hospital and grew up in Ferryville. Was very active as a young person and helping his father out with various stores, particularly in Crawford County. So it's great to be talking about Pat Lucey here. Great to be talking about Pat Lucey, period. Now, you may ask, why write a book about Pat Lucey? Why? Thank you for that question. It was surprising to me that a book had not been written about Pat Lucey because he was governor and active as an official in the state and as a politician in the state and in the country during a period that was very transformative in our history. This was a time when we professionalized state government. It was a time when we reconfigured and reconceptualized how we did taxing and spending in the state, and that still is with us. And we'll talk a little bit more about exactly what those mean. He was very productive in terms of public policies and legislation that got passed. In fact, as I was writing the 2 chapters that focus on public policy initiatives during the Lucey era, there were so many, and I was starting to get sort of tired. And so I just ended up abbreviating that and listing them all in an appendix because there were just so many, and those are just, the ones in the appendix are the major ones. And the other thing that happened, in large part because of Pat Lucey and his leadership, is that Wisconsin was transformed from basically a one-party state, a state that then went into a real chaotic period in terms of politics and public policy, into a very competitive, or some people would call it, a purple state. And he's largely responsible for that. And in terms of writing a book on Pat Lucey, there were 2 people who got started writing a book. One of them was a good friend of mine and a colleague in the political science department in Wisconsin, David Adaman, who was very close personally and professionally to Pat Lucey. And he got started writing a book, and he unfortunately died. I mean, collected a lot of material, 26 boxes of documents and newspaper clippings and things like that, but died before he even had a chance to get started outlining things and writing. Another person that got started writing a book about Pat Lucey was Neil Shively. Some of you may remember that name. He was a very prominent reporter with the Milwaukee Sentinel at the time. And he was very eager to write a book on Pat Lucey and interviewed him. I, in fact, have tapes of the interviews that Neil conducted. And he kind of got started outlining some chapters, but really didn't get very far. And then he died. So Doreen Adaman, David's sister, knew of all this material that had been collected. And she knew of her brother's desire to have a book written on Pat Lucey. She got a group of people together and said, you know, we've got to have this project completed. And who do you suggest we ask to do that? And I don't think that they were wishing me ill, but they suggested my name, and hey, I survived. I didn't follow the pattern of the other 2 authors, and I'm happy for that. And I had a great deal of fun. It was very challenging. There's a lot of material that was collected, saved me maybe 2 or 3 years of collecting that material. And there were 8 oral histories that Pat had conducted. That was very, very useful. I conducted myself 42 interviews, and that was very enjoyable to talk and have these in-depth interviews with people who had known Pat, some of his friends and some of his enemies. But it was quite a project. As a person, Pat was just that in itself, quite apart from his contribution to politics and public policy. As I said, he grew up in this area, small rural area, fairy town, and some of you are familiar with that. It's one of these places, with due respect, that if you blink, you might miss it as you're driving down Highway 35. He grew up in an Irish Catholic family, a very Catholic family, in a community dominated almost entirely by Norwegian Lutherans. And that in itself had an effect on Pat and his appreciation for diversity, his appreciation for being kind of a minority from a cultural standpoint in a community. Pat was not charismatic. He did not give the greatest speeches in the world. In fact, he was giving a speech at Holy Cross in Massachusetts when he was running for vice president, when he was on the ticket with John Anderson in 1980. Anderson running, of course, for president. And he was giving a speech, and after a little while he stopped and he said, it's okay to applaud. Everybody was just sitting there silent. It was a great speech if you read it, but when he gave it, it was sort of, he was in many ways really, he was very analytical, great thinker, and you might even call him a nerd, very much like a college professor. Not much of a personality, but really got into things and wanted to think them through. And I think that was good from the standpoint of developing good public policy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus a bit on his contribution to making Wisconsin purple, if you will, and talk a little bit about his success as a business person. And I want to leave time for your questions and comments and wisecracks, so I'll wrap up so we've got plenty of time to have a discussion instead of just me talking. When Pat and Lucey came of voting age, it was late 1940s, 46, and Wisconsin's politics was really pretty chaotic. The state, since the time of the Civil War, had been dominated by the Republican Party, and after the Civil War, the Republican Party became a machine in what most of us would regard as the worst possible way that a machine is identified. There were three people who controlled the state. If you wanted a job, if you wanted to get into politics, if you wanted to almost anything alone, you had to get the machine bosses to sign on. And that was one part of it. Then Bob LaFollette, of course, we all know about him in Wisconsin history. He then attacked the machine and didn't destroy it, but he damaged it severely, and the Republican Party became split internally between progressives following Bob LaFollette and the machine, or stalwart Republicans as they were known. So that's the Republican Party. The progressives, after Bob LaFollette Sr. died, split off because they didn't want to have these internal debates all the time within the party, and they formed the Progressive Party, capital P, capital P. And they did that in 1934, and that was really dominated by Bob LaFollette's two sons, Bob Jr. and Phil. Bob Jr. became a U.S. Senator, Phil became governor, so they were very successful in that standpoint. And they were in power occasionally, but in 1946, they decided that they had to just disband the Progressive Party, in part because the Progressive Party, and particularly the Follett brothers, particularly Phil, had national aspirations. And if you've got national aspirations and you're from a third party, as we often refer to them, within a particular state, you're not going to do very well. And indeed, you tried and you didn't do very well. So they got together in 1946 in Portage, and they had this convention, and they decided, okay, we're going to disband the Progressive Party. It's going to exist no longer. And then the big question was, okay, so do we go back to the Republican Party? Do we join the Democratic Party? What do we do? And people were not united on that. Bob Jr., the senator, said, well, my dad never wanted to become a Democrat. I'm going back to the Republican Party. I know we had difficulties within the party, but come on, join me, and we'll become a dynamic force within the Republican Party. Some people did, but not everybody followed him. Some were kind of homeless, and some were thinking, well, maybe we should join the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at the time was very conservative. There were, I don't know, 17 Democrats throughout the whole state of Wisconsin. I mean, it was tiny, it was inconsequential. They were so, they did so poorly, they didn't even qualify to get on the ballot at one point. So they were in really bad shape. And the Wisconsin Democratic Party did not support Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the New Deal. They're very much opposed to that. It's sort of like, well, you know, as progressives, we like Roosevelt and he likes us. So this isn't going to be very good. So some of them went there nonetheless. And then the other thing that was happening during this period of time was the Socialist Party in Milwaukee. The Socialist Party in Milwaukee was basically in the tradition of German Christian socialists. They were often regarded as sewer socialists. That was a positive term. I know most of us don't regard sewers as positive, but the point of calling them sewer socialists was that their main concern was public works, getting good sanitation, getting public housing, the parks that we still see and enjoy in Milwaukee is a legacy from this period. So they were in Milwaukee, very popular in Milwaukee, had labor union support and the like. But they were really not all that successful statewide. Dan Holm was their leader, and he at one point said, you know, we don't really like the Democrats, we don't really like Roosevelt, but he's going in the right direction. Maybe realistically it makes sense for us to become Democrats. So this is what's going on. Got some sense of this chaos, a lot of people with a lot of questions. Enter Pat Lucey, not by himself, but with other names that those of us familiar with Wisconsin history will recognize. Gaylord Nelson, Tom Fairchild, James Doyle Sr., the father of the Jim Doyle who was most recently a governor. A number of other people, and what they did is they got together in 1948 and they said, okay, should we try and take over the Wisconsin Democratic Party? Well, that's kind of cumbersome, and they didn't like the identification with the Wisconsin Democratic Party. So they said, well, okay, let's do this. Let's form a new party, and then get recognized nationally as the Democratic Party in Wisconsin. So keep these names in mind: Wisconsin Democratic Party, Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Democratic Party is the old one that opposes FDR and the New Deal, okay? What Jim Doyle and Gaylord Nelson and Pat Lucey and the rest do is they form what they call the Democratic Organizing Committee, the DOC, to kind of get their act together and then apply to the national government, to the national party, to be recognized as the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Not the Wisconsin Democratic Party, the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, which is technically the name of the party today. Okay, you got that? Yeah. that all was very important from a legal standpoint because you've got to be recognized as for the national in order to be delegates at the presidential nominating convention, and you also have to be recognized in order to collect dues, have members, put people on the ballot in state law, in accordance with Wisconsin state law. So there was a technical reason for this, but it was also important because they did want to have some distance there. And indeed, in 1954, they got recognized by the National Democratic Party, and the Wisconsin Democratic Party was no more. They just kind of vanished, and nobody noticed. They hadn't been there very visible in any case. The role that Pat Lucey had played was he had run for the assembly from this area of the state and won. It was an incredible victory because he took on the person who was the speaker of the assembly at the time and had been prominent statewide politician for years, and he surprised everybody by beating this guy. And so the Democratic Organizing Committee, and particularly Jim Doyle, Sr., when I say Jim Doyle, unless I specify to the contrary, it's going to be Jim Doyle, Sr., okay? Jim Doyle contacted, he's the sort of head of the Democratic Organizing Committee right now, and he then contacts Pat Lucey and says, gee, wonderful job you did out there in western Wisconsin, and that's fantastic. How would you like to be hired as the organizing secretary of the Democratic Organizing Committee? And he told them what their whole scheme was and everything. Well, Pat had another option, and it was a very attractive option. His dad was an incredible entrepreneur, very, very successful entrepreneur. Started out with a general store in Ferryville. That was a success. He bought one in Burlington, bought another general store. He got a John Deere dealership. I mean, he was very entrepreneurial. At one point, particularly during the Second World War, people were having a hard time getting farm implements, and he went around and collected farm implements that were kind of sitting and rusting, got them in repairs so that they could be working. And then he established, worked with a financial institution to establish another financial institution where if you couldn't get a loan to buy these implements, he would give you a loan through this other institution. And a lot of people really benefited from that. So he was going gangbusters and asked Pat if he would really help him out with a family business. So Pat had that option. It was very attractive, as I say. But he was really concerned about one major issue, and that major issue was Joe McCarthy. Think about the time period that we're talking about now. Joe McCarthy had been elected as a senator from Wisconsin. He was very irresponsible in accusing people of being a communist, red baiting. He became a scourge nationally as well as within the state, a great embarrassment. Pat was very, very concerned about this. And he knew that Jim Doyle had connections with people out east who were very concerned about Joe McCarthy and were providing help, including money to get the Wisconsin effort going to get rid of Joe McCarthy. So Pat said, yeah, I'm with you. And he became the organizing secretary for the Democratic Organizing Committee, which became the Democratic Party. An important decision that Pat made, it was controversial, was to do with the Democratic Party statewide what he was doing, what he did with his own campaign when he had that upset victory to get into the assembly from western Wisconsin. And that was to really base the party on grassroots and on shoe leather. There was an alternative model in Minnesota. Some of you may be familiar with the Democratic Farm Labor Committee in Minnesota. They were going through a similar kind of situation, not exactly identical, but they were getting organized to sort of be a viable force. And their model was to take the farm organizations and the labor organizations and have them be formally a part of the Democratic Party, so that you had the interest groups, you had them sitting at the table, they were calling the shots, they were the Democratic Party in a sense. Pat said, yeah, we could do that in Wisconsin too, and indeed, farmers around the state have been organizing. They have been involved in milk strikes, and the 30s was really chaotic. The labor, the coal strike that was going on, that was a major issue. So we could do the same thing in Wisconsin, but I think that it's better if we do this from the grassroots and do what I did. We'll go around, we'll get people using their shoe leather, and we'll build it grassroots from the bottom up rather than from the top down. And that was his model, and the result was that, and I know if you're following Wisconsin politics now, you'll find this as a surprise, the major source of support for the Democratic Party initially was from small towns and rural areas. And Pat had a hell of a time trying to get support in Madison. He got support mainly because Jim Doyle told people in Madison to support him. Milwaukee, they had their own issues and the legacy of the Socialist Party, and they weren't all that enthusiastic either. But Pat worked and worked. He eventually, the really key critical event happened when Joe McCarthy died in office. He died in the middle of his second term, or towards the end of his second term in office. He was a very heavy drinker, and that took its toll on his body. And so he died, and in 1957, there was a special election to determine who would fill the remainder of Joe McCarthy's term. And Pat Lucey became the campaign manager for Bill Proxmire. And Bill Proxmire, as you may know, won that special election. Bill Proxmire had run previously many times as governor. In fact, John Patrick Hunter, one of the prominent journalists and columnists in the state, had a quip where he said, Bill Proxmire has run so often in the state of Wisconsin that people think they're voting for an incumbent. But he had never been elected to anything until he got elected as U.S. Senator in that special election. So that was 1957. The next year, 1958, Bill Proxmire runs for the full term, wins. Gaylord Nelson runs to be governor. He wins. Democrats pick up the majority in the Assembly. First time since the Civil War that the Democrats were in the majority. I mean, it was just incredible. And most people said, this is Pat Lucey. This was his organizing, his strategizing, his bringing people together, his forming a new coalition of people in rural areas, people in small towns, and then eventually the support of people in Madison and Milwaukee as well. Pat then went on and continued to be very active politically, helping candidates. He was very instrumental in John F. Kennedy's victory here in Wisconsin to become the nominee for the Democratic Party for president. He ended up losing to Richard Nixon in the general election in Wisconsin, although he won nationally, of course. And Pat Lucey became very, very close to the Kennedy family. And even though most people identified him as being very important and very strategic in helping John Kennedy win that nomination, his closest ties were with Bobby Kennedy. And he was torn. The assassination of John Kennedy really shook everybody up, including Pat Lucey. Pat Lucey was actually on his way to Ohio to help run the campaign for John's re-election at the time that he found out that President Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. It took him a while to recover from that, and he then thought, he just got real upset about the war in Vietnam and the people dying in that particular conflict. So even though he generally supported Lyndon Johnson, he really was very supportive of Bobby Kennedy, challenging Johnson for the nomination when Johnson was going to run for re-election. And as you recall, I'm sure, Bobby Kennedy indeed was such a threat that Lyndon Johnson bowed out. He said, okay, I'm not going to run anymore. And then Bobby Kennedy, unfortunately, was assassinated in Los Angeles. And Pat Lucey was actually about to had scheduled to meet with Bobby right after, minutes after Bobby had been assassinated. And being so close to Bobby personally as well as a politician, Pat Lucey, he got in a funk. He got very depressed, and he was about to throw in the towel and say, heck with it, I'm out of politics. This gets too violent, people get too hateful, I'm just not going to do it. And he eventually ended up supporting Gene McCarthy as the alternative to Bobby Kennedy after Bobby got assassinated, and did get back involved in politics, and of course got elected in 1970 as governor of Wisconsin. Before talking about his term as governor, and I'll talk briefly about that and then open it up for questions, comments, and wisecracks. The other thing that should be noted, I said that Pat Lucey had made a decision between going into politics and working with his dad in the family business. Well, that kind of decision somewhat came back to him after he got married. He got married in 1951 to Jean Velasquez from Milwaukee. Pat's father had told his kids, there were 3 boys and 3 girls in the family, and he said to each of them, okay, I want you to marry an Irish Catholic Democrat. Irish Catholic Democrat. Well, none of them did. 2 of them became priests, 1 became a nun, but even Pat, who certainly, he was very Irish, very proud of his Irish tradition and heritage, very proud of being a Democrat. He did not marry an Irish Catholic at all. He married a Greek Orthodox, very Greek. Jean was fluent in Greek, but she didn't learn how to speak English until she went to school. I mean, it was, so that was, he departed, but that in a sense is a side story. After they got married, Pat said, gee, you know, I'm earning $500 a month as the organizing secretary putting this Democratic Party together. $500 a month. And Jean and I want to have a family. How am I going to do that on $500 a month? And $500 a month was worth more then than it is now, and not that much more. So he went to Jim Doyle, friend and mentor, and said, yeah, here's my situation. What do you think? So Jim said, well, you know, what you could do is you could get into a business that gives you a lot of flexibility so that you could be making money, but you could have a lot of time to devote to your organizing activities, your political activities and the like. And what I would suggest is you see my friend who's involved in real estate. and see if you can get a job as a real estate agent. Well, that's what Pat did, is he went into real estate. And and Gene was a great partner, really helped him out tremendously. And he did it mainly for this flexible schedule kind of issue. His father partnered with him initially and brought in what today is worth $2 million as an investment to help Pat out and get started in his real estate business. In 10 years, Pat and Gene were getting $6 million a year in sales. They were the largest real estate agent in Dane County, which was getting a lot of building and a lot of development was going on. They were very, very successful in their business. And just before he ran for governor, he and Gene established a development that some of you might be familiar with, the Madison area would be familiar with, and that's Wexford Village. Wexford Village, they got that going with a $600 million investment. It's a fantastic development area with single homes and multiple homes and some churches, and it's a really very nice community, very well thought of on the west side of Madison. In Wexford, by the way, he chose that name because Wexford is where John Kennedy and his family are from in Ireland. So that's the connection is with, again, the Irish heritage. So, and it was interesting, when I sort of got into this, actually I found out information that I would draft chapters and share information with like his children and some of his friends. And the reaction I got from his kids was, holy cow, I didn't know that Dad was that successful. He had that much money? Gee, I didn't know. They were surprised, and a lot of people were. They hadn't been paying that much attention because Pat was known primarily as a politician, not as a business person, but he was very successful as a business person. And enjoyed it immensely, enjoyed the challenges and the activity. As I was getting into that, one of the things that I was concerned about, sort of thinking, with my political science hat on, I'm thinking, gee, real estate, politics, those are the ingredients a lot of times for a scandal. As you know, governments have to give permits, governments have development plans, governments do all sorts of things that have an impact on land values and development plans and all of that sort of stuff. I looked and looked and looked and was able to get into some detailed information in the archives and not a hint of a scandal. And I don't mean, obviously, to say if you're in real estate, you're a crook, or if you're in politics, you're a crook, and if you're in real estate and politics, you for sure are a crook. I don't mean to say that, but it's just sort of, I was suspicious, and I pursued it, and I was impressed. He was very honest and really kept his distance. He didn't pressure people in the city council or the county board to do certain kinds of things to make his land more valuable. As governor, Pat, as I mentioned, was very, very progressive. A lot of things happened when he was governor. And just a couple of them, one of the things that he's most known for is the development of the University of Wisconsin system, the merger. At the time that he became governor, he was dealing with two separate systems. There was the University of Wisconsin, which consisted of Madison, Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Parkside, those four. And then there was the Wisconsin University system, La Crosse, Platteville, Whitewater, all the others. So there were 9 of those campuses, those universities. And it was sort of, they each had their board of regents, it seemed like they were competing with one another. It just seemed very inefficient. Why a state, Wisconsin is not that rich a state, we're not that populous a state. Why do we have 2 separate university systems? Doesn't make any sense. So he wanted to merge them. And actually, and this was a pattern that was repeated over and over. The idea began with Republicans. There was a Kellogg Commission established by Governor Warren Knowles, very, very popular Republican governor who preceded Lucey. And that didn't get passed in the legislature, and there were some issues. And so what Pat basically did is he took the Kellogg Commission recommendations, tweaked them a bit to take care of the issues, and then proposed it. And it was very widely accepted and applauded by every part of the state except Madison. And I still have colleagues who say, "Oh, that's a terrible idea," and actually a lot of people in power at the Madison campus who thought and think that it was a terrible idea. As distinguished a person as Pat Lucey is, he has gotten honorary degrees from all sorts of places, but not his alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which I think is a travesty, just terrible. And anytime you bring it up, all you hear is, and you got the system going. The fear of Madison was that, and it was a very snotty kind of approach that my colleagues were taking, very snotty. It's sort of like, well, if they put us in the same system as these whole other places like lacrosse, we're all gonna sink, we're all gonna go down to the bottom. So like, give me a break. The other universities around the system, maybe with the exception of one or two, are really, they're great universities. They provide great opportunities, great education, they've got great specialties, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison can stand on its own. University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee can stand on its own. So it wasn't a threat, but it was perceived as a threat, and they really, really opposed it. But despite the opposition, it got through, and it is now a system that is 51 years old. It'll be 52 years old in October, and doing very well. Something else that was a real high priority for Pat Lucey was property taxes. Property taxes at the time that he was governor, at the time that he was elected, and for about a decade and a half before, were increasing at the rate of 10% a year. Imagine that, 10% a year, every year, got more and more property taxes. And one of the reasons for that is because the local governments were really responsible for a lot of government expenditures. They were responsible for all of the welfare programs, not the state, not the federal government. They were responsible for criminal justice. Most of the people who were incarcerated were in county jails, not in state penitentiaries. And the counties had to pay for that. The court systems, the prosecutors were all on the local tax bill. So there was a lot there. And importantly, the schools. The state only provided a little bit less than 35% of the cost of running our schools. The rest had to be provided by the local communities. So there was a lot of expenses, and that's one major reason why the property taxes were going up and up and up and up. Another couple of problems with the property tax at the time was that farmers and businesses were getting unfairly kind of double taxed. If you were a farmer, if you had a business, you were being paid, you had to pay taxes on your property, not on your income, on your property. And then in addition, of course, you had to be paying taxes on your income. Well, Pat didn't think that made a whole lot of sense. He thought, if we're going to be taxing, let's tax on income, not on inventory, not on the acres that they own in their farm. And the other thing that was a problem was that the burden was really on the poor communities, in that the system at the time was what is called point of origin. And that is that as a community, you paid taxes into the state, and you got money back from the state based on the taxes that you paid to the state. So you had, and a big example in the debate at the time was River Hills. I don't know how many of you, anybody familiar with River Hills? No rich people here? River Hills is a suburb in Milwaukee known for having gigantic lawns and mansions and houses, and a very, very wealthy community. And River Hills was getting back from the state all sorts of money because they were paying money into the state. And yet poorer communities who really needed the money were not. So what Pat came up with was what was called an equalization formula, which we still have today. It's been tweaked a lot, and it's not as pure as some of us might like, but it's essentially you pay in and then you get back based on your needs. You know, what are your school needs? What are your needs that you've got, rather than how much you put in, because then it's just the rich get richer, the poor get poor kind of thing. And the other thing that Pat put in are levy limits, which sometimes are a frustration, I know. So that he said, well, okay, if we're going to be providing all this property tax relief, we have to be careful that the local governments aren't saying, good, no, we could raise property taxes more and more and more. And then you just sort of nullify the property tax relief that takes place. Pat had a very ambitious agenda. He had actually a paper, a list of items, major policy changes that he wanted to have made. And he focused on those. Very unlike most other governors. Governors really have an opportunity to set an agenda. And Pat had an agenda, it was very focused, he was very focused. And when President Carter asked him to resign as governor and become ambassador to Mexico, which Pat did, Pat said, I will only do that if I at least get one more thing on my list accomplished, and that's court reorganization. The court organization at the time was very chaotic and duplicative. We had justices of the peace, and we had backlog at the Supreme Court level that went on and on for years and years. Pat wanted to focus on that. He had to get the Constitution amended to do it. And that was his last major accomplishment. And he ended up, when he became ambassador to Mexico, everything on his list except one, no-fault automobile insurance, had been accomplished. He was sorry about that, but hey, duty calls to become ambassador. So why don't I stop there and let you ask questions or whatever. Yes?
The students who went to Madison.
Give him the mic.
Students that went to Madison and all the other state universities in the early 60s were supported by the money from the state. And I started out at this place in 1965 with something that the state supported 75% and the students 25%. How did that get turned around that now the average student can't even afford to go out here, which was Madison?
Yeah, good question. When I think of Pat over here, he'd say the same thing you just did. Well, how? He might put in an expletive or two. How did that happen?
I left them out.
And I think and this has happened actually in more states than Wisconsin. It's very common kind of thing. And that is that public universities are an easy target. They're an easy target if you're a legislator or a governor, and you've got a budget deficit, and you need to generate more money. There are two places in your budget that the state spends the most money and controls the most money. One is prisons, and the other is the universities. Well, are you really going to be cutting prisons? Probably not. that's politically, maybe, but I mean, Tommy Thompson is now saying he made a mistake building all those prisons and he shouldn't have done it. So he realizes that was, that is a big gobble up of your budget. But politically, it's risky to do it. So you focus on the university, and you get that money because you control it. It's money that comes from you, it doesn't come from the feds. And what you do is you make an argument that, the university students are the ones who are profiting from their education. They're the ones who ought to be paying, which of course is a way of looking at things which is really not entirely right. One of the traditions in our state and a number of other states is to be sensitive to the common good, to the kinds of things that we do that make up for the welfare of our communities as a whole. And having a well-educated population is helpful for jobs, it's helpful for governance, all sorts of other things. But you forget that and you say, the students are the ones who are going to be benefiting because they have a degree, let them pay. So it's really, they're very vulnerable. And again, Wisconsin is not alone, which doesn't mean that it's comfortable. But does that make sense? Yeah.
What did you feel about reciprocity with Minnesota then?
Governor Lucey was very favorable about reciprocity with Minnesota. Those of you familiar with that, if you're a Minnesota student or a Wisconsin student, you pay the tuition in your home state rather than where you're going to the university. Pat thought that made sense. He was very close to a lot of people in Minnesota. He recognized that Minnesota and Wisconsin are very similar in culture, their makeup, and everything. Minnesota's got a good education system, K through 12, so we'd be getting good students. And it's interesting, I don't know the most recent statistics, but I know before I retired, the pattern was that actually Wisconsin benefited from that, not only financially, which we did, but also in terms of students. Madison got more Minnesota students than any of the other universities in Wisconsin, which was a surprise. Everybody thought that it would be more like Eau Claire and La Crosse, and the university is closer to home. But I guess these Minnesota kids wanted to get away from home.
Yeah. Who is the politician? Who is the politician that had this beat in that initial assembly seat?
Oh, it was Gardner Winthrop. Anybody remember him? No? Yeah, he had I think he got elected like 6 times in a row in 2-year terms. And he had made it to be Speaker of the Assembly. And towards the end of his time there, he had become pretty obnoxious, and a lot of the Republicans didn't like him either. He was a Republican in the Assembly. And when Pat Lucey was introduced the first time in the Assembly, there were a lot of Republicans that got up and cheered, "Hey, we got it." Yeah.
Could you just talk a little bit about Pat's relationship with Bobby Kennedy?
Yeah, Pat's relationship with Bobby Kennedy, very, very close. When Bobby decided that he was going to run for president, Pat was one of the 4 people, including Jackie Onassis and Bobby's father, Joseph, that he consulted. So he was very close in that standpoint. When Pat was helping Jack Kennedy run here in Wisconsin, most of his contacts were actually with Bobby, not with Jack. And the convention, when Jack got nominated to be president, Pat was a floor leader and worked very closely with Bobby in that regard as well. And the two of them had the same kind of change in terms of their view about Vietnam and Lyndon Johnson and what was needed for for the country and for the Democratic Party. So he was very, very close. He was with Bobby Kennedy in Indiana. Some of you may know about this. The night that Martin Luther King was assassinated, Bobby Kennedy was in Indiana, Indianapolis, to be very precise, campaigning for his bid for the presidency. And the police were very, very concerned about security because, Martin Luther King had just been assassinated. Wow. And Bobby Kennedy had just been, Jack Kennedy had been assassinated. So it's sort of like, well, what kind of a country do we have here? So they went to Bobby and they said, you got to call this rally off. You got to call this rally off. And Bobby turned it to Pat. The two of them conferred. They said, no, we're going to go ahead. We're going to go ahead. And they found that the stage had been taken down that was set up for the rally. But they found a flatbed truck. They got up on this flatbed of the truck, set up a sound system, and it was at that point that Bobby Kennedy gave a really powerful, emotional speech. And for the first time since his brother's assassination, said the words. He said, my brother was assassinated. I know how it feels. I know how it hurts. And I know how you're hurting now because Martin Luther King was assassinated. And he kind of developed that theme for a while and said, it doesn't make any sense to go out and riot or to be violent or to try and take vengeance or anything like that. Let's all go home and pray and think. Indianapolis was the only major city in the country that did not have a riot that night. Bobby Kennedy and Pat Lucey were very, very, very close in their sentiments. Personally, and when they had that meeting, that critical meeting that was mentioned with Pat and Joe Kennedy and Jackie Onassis were deciding whether or not Bobby Kennedy really ought to go run for president. Jackie said, I understand how you feel, but I'm really afraid that the same thing is going to happen to you that happened to Jack. It did. And Bobby Kennedy, and he conferred with Pat a lot about this. He said he was scared. The whole campaign, he was scared because he realized that, if you really want to assassinate somebody, it doesn't make any difference what kind of Secret Service protection you get or anything like that. You could probably do it. Just enough crazy people who don't care about their own welfare and people who are hateful, but we can do it. Well, I don't want to end on that note. Let me end on a note where, let me make this observation. Pat Lucey is somebody born in La Crosse, raised in Ferryville, knew poverty. His family went through the Depression. Talk about a rags to riches story. Became a multimillionaire, a major figure nationally, an ambassador, etc. A real rags to riches story. And when you think about it, Pat could have taken a different kind of approach. He could have basically taken that other approach that a lot of Americans do of, in this country, if you're born poor, you can be rich, and it's up to you to be rich, and go for the rich, go for the wealthy, to heck with everybody else. It's, fight and be an entrepreneur and step over people if you have to. That's what you need to do to be successful. We're familiar with that story. And he didn't do that. He didn't do that. He took his lessons from growing up in this area, took his lessons from poverty, lot of it was influenced by the kind of Jesuit tradition of Catholicism, of social justice and concern for others. And he translated that into public policies that are still benefiting the state. He translated that into national policies that he advocated when he was running for office nationally, working with Mexico, etc. So I think he left a legacy, and it's somebody that obviously I think we can all be proud of. Thank you very much.